All right, so next is our series of AUC Section 240 that discusses fraud and the auditor's responsibility to opine on whether there are misstatements that could be due to fraud. We come down to AUC Sections 240.04, 05, 6, 7, and 8. And we'll also discuss the objectives of this section here at AUC Section 10, or 240.10. But first, we'll discuss some of the responsibilities for the prevention and detection of fraud. And as we've seen in other AUC sections, as well as this one, the responsibility for the prevention and detection of fraud is that of management and governance of the entity. It's not the auditor's responsibility to prevent or detect fraud. We saw in other areas of gas that our responsibility is to detect material misstatements that could be due to fraud, but not necessarily for us to detect fraud directly. So since it's management and those charged with governance responsibility to prevent and detect fraud, it's really important for them to emphasize fraud prevention and reducing opportunities for fraud to take place, and also fraud deterrence to maybe make it less likely that people will commit fraud, because then they'll be punished if it's found out. So to do that, management and those charged with governance should set a culture of honesty and ethical behavior that reinforces that oversight throughout the companies, in hopes that employees and other stakeholders will act honestly in carrying out their duties. Those charged with governance and also management should also look out for ways that controls can be overridden or inappropriate influence can be placed on the financial reporting process, which would give management the opportunity to manage their earnings or deceive the users of the financial statements regarding the company's performance and profitability. So those charged with governance has a big responsibility to set policies in place to prevent and detect fraud, and to set a tone at the top that fraud will not be acceptable in the company. So now that we've kind of described a little bit of management's responsibility and those who charge governance responsibility for preventing and detecting fraud, let's discuss the responsibilities of the auditor. As we've said many, many times, the auditor's responsibility is for obtaining reasonable assurance that the financial statements as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether caused by fraud or error. So it doesn't say that our responsibility is to find fraud. Our responsibility is to find material misstatements that could possibly be due to fraud. And so, as we saw in, I think, AUC Section 200, there's some inherent limitations to performing the audit. And one of those inherent limitations is that fraud may be occurring at the company, which would possibly make it to where we didn't detect the fraud or the misstatements that are result from that fraud. So even though our responsibility is not to detect fraud, we do have a responsibility for detecting material misstatements. And so that's sort of why this AUC Section 240 was put together, because this is a really tough line to tiptoe, because even though we're not required to find fraud, we need to understand our risks related to fraud at the company so that we can plan for and respond to risks that fraud might be creating misstatements. And so continuing on in our discussion here, the risk of not detecting a material misstatement resulting from fraud is higher than the risk of not detecting one resulting from error. And this is because fraud includes very sophisticated and organized schemes that are designed to conceal it, such as forgery, deliberate failures to record transactions, or intentional misrepresentations being made to the auditor. And so all of these things, including maybe collusion, where multiple employees are involved in this fraud, make it very difficult for us to obtain reasonable assurance, because the information that we're provided may be false. And so whether they're able to pull the wool over our eyes, so to say, would depend on how skillful they are, or the frequency and extent of the manipulation, or the degree of collusion involved, as well as the size of the amounts manipulated, and how senior the individuals are at the company that are involved with this. So we might be able to identify potential opportunities for fraud, but it's difficult for us to decide whether maybe a misstatement is caused by error or fraud, because the two may be somewhat indistinguishable. But fortunately for us, our only responsibility is to find misstatements. It's not necessarily to say whether it's due to fraud or due to error. It's just it could be due to one of those. And so the risk of the auditor not detecting a material misstatement resulting from management fraud is greater than for employee fraud, because management is frequently in a position to directly or indirectly manipulate the accounting records to present fraudulent financial information or override control procedures designed to prevent similar frauds by other employees. Therefore, management is very much a big risk for us as far as fraudulent activity, because they have the ability to override controls. And the problem is that management is the one who frequently provides most of the information to us that we obtain. So, and that's why throughout all of the sections we see a lot about professional skepticism, and that we should trust but verify, so to speak. And that's what we see here, is that we're responsible for maintaining professional skepticism throughout the audit, considering that management could possibly override controls. And usually that's included as a financial statement level risk, which we'll find in future AUC sections. And we should also understand that some of the procedures that we do in order to detect errors in the financial statements or accounts may not be effective for detecting fraud. And so that's partly why this AUC Section 240 is in place, is to help us develop procedures that would help us detect fraudulent misstatements. And having said that, we can go down to the objectives of this AUC Section 240, and that is that the objectives of us in complying with the requirements of this section is to identify and assess the risk of material misstatement of the financial statements due to fraud, obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding the assessed risk of material misstatement due to fraud through designing and implementing appropriate responses, and respond appropriately to fraud or suspected fraud identified during the audit. And so to summarize this, by following AUC Section 240, we hope to identify the risk of material misstatement due to fraud, to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, to support whether there is a misstatement or not that's related to fraud, and then finally to respond appropriately when we do detect material misstatements due to fraud. And so the next several videos in this series will discuss what we can do to achieve these objectives.